The sky above central Germany on the morning of the 7th of October, 1944, was the kind of sky that pilots called honest, clear, cold, and wide enough to see anything coming from any direction. At 20,000 feet, the air temperature hovered near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the exhaust from the Packard-built Merlin engines of 8 North American P-51D Mustangs trailed behind the formation in thin white ribbons that dissolved almost before they formed, the altitude too great for persistent contrails. Captain Jack Collins, 26 years old and holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions over Regensburg the previous spring, sat in the cockpit of his aircraft, named Evangeline after his mother, her name lettered in careful block script beneath the canopy rail by a crew chief from Akron who had a gift for the work, and chewed his gum and watched the earth below with the particular quality of attention that distinguished men who had survived a great many combat missions from those who had not. He did not look at the earth because it was beautiful, though on mornings like this it was. He looked at it because it told him things. The smoke columns rising from Frankfurt to the southwest meant the 8th Air Force's heavy bombers had come through on schedule. The absence of flak over his immediate position meant the German radar operators had not yet refined his flight's exact altitude and heading. And the unusual emptiness of the sky to his east, where, on missions of this type, escorting Focke-Wulf FW-190s or Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs almost always appeared within the first 15 minutes, meant something that he could not yet name, but that his body understood before his mind did. He called his wingman on the VHF radio. "Richie, what's your sky look like?" The voice that answered was younger than his by 4 years and carried, even across the static and the crackle of combat radio, the particular unguardedness of a man who had not yet learned to sound calm when he was not. Lieutenant Richard Fox, 22, 3 missions, had joined the 357th Fighter Group out of Leaston in late September. He wrote to his mother in Dayton, Ohio, every week without exception. He had never seen an Me-109 at closer range than 1,000 yards, which was close enough to kill, and far enough that you could half convince yourself afterwards that it had been a kind of geometry problem, and not a matter of a man dying in fire. "Empty, sir," Fox said. "Nothing but blue." "That's what worries me." Collins rolled the Mustang slightly left and right, checking above and below in the habit that had been drilled into him since his first days at Tuskegee. He caught himself thinking of that irony sometimes. The Army teaching a man from Georgia to fly before it could quite bring itself to accept that he was doing so as an officer. All the indignities of the separate facilities and the separate everything that followed him even into the sky, even now, and saw nothing unusual. 8 P-51s in close formation, a flight from the 364th Fighter Squadron tasked with top cover escort on the return leg of the bombing mission. Fuel states nominal, guns charged, everyone where they ought to be. He was still turning his head when the 2 white contrail lines appeared below and to the east. They were not the contrails of piston-engine aircraft. He knew the look of every aircraft in the European theater by its contrail as surely as he knew the voices of his pilots by their radio inflection. These contrails were wrong, in the way that a sound is wrong when you hear it in a house and cannot identify which room it comes from. They were moving too fast, too clean, too geometrically straight, without the wavering that came from propeller wash disturbing the slipstream. He had time to think, what is that? Then the 2 aircraft came up through the formation from below. No propellers. The engines made a sound that none of them had ever heard. Not a roar, not the familiar thunder of Allisons or Merlins or BMW radials, but a whine that climbed the register above the threshold of normal engine noise into something almost pure, almost abstract. The 2 aircraft were shaped like nothing in the recognition manuals that Collins had memorized in the summer of '43. Swept wings, twin engine pods beneath the wings rather than in the nose. A clean, uncluttered fuselage that seemed designed by someone who had removed everything that was not strictly necessary and kept only the essentials of flight and killing. Each aircraft passed through the formation at a closing speed that Collins would later estimate conservatively, at more than 300 miles per hour relative to the Mustangs. The entire event took less than 4 seconds. The P-51 on the far right of the formation, piloted by Technical Sergeant David Morrison, 31 years old, a poker player of significant talent, and the man Collins had bunked next to since the autumn of 1942, disappeared in a fireball. The explosion was thorough and immediate. There was no falling aircraft afterward, only a smear of orange and black that the wind caught and dispersed within seconds. The P-51 beside it lost its right wing at the root and entered a flat spin, already beyond recovery. Collins had been flying combat aircraft for 2 years and 11 months. He had been in 17 engagements with enemy fighters, had been shot at by flak batteries on more than 80 missions, had twice brought a damaged aircraft back to England on improvised judgment and prayer. In that time, he had learned that the first few seconds after something catastrophic happened were not the time for grief or fear. Those were the seconds when you asked where the threat was now, and whether it was coming back, and what you could do about it. He keyed the radio. "Brake, brake, brake! All flights, brake right, watch below!" But there was nothing to brake toward. By the time his thumb came off the transmit button, the 2 German aircraft were already gone. 2 diminishing specks at the eastern edge of vision that vanished entirely in less than 15 seconds, accelerating away at a speed that no piston-engine aircraft could match, could even approach. Collins watched the horizon where they had gone until there was absolutely nothing left to watch, and then he turned his attention to the place where Morrison's aircraft had been. There was smoke there. Only smoke. Fox's voice came over the radio, stripped of whatever composure it usually carried. "What was that? What was that, sir? What just happened?" Collins took a breath. Outside the cockpit, the air at 20,000 feet was the same it had always been. Cold, indifferent, permanent. Below him, the landscape of Germany in early autumn, brown and green and crossed with the roads and rivers that had been there long before either of them was born and would be there long after. He released his breath slowly. "I don't know yet," he said. He was lying, and he knew it, and he suspected Fox knew it too. He knew exactly what had just happened. He had read the intelligence reports circulated through the 8th Air Force's fighter commands over the preceding months. Fragmentary, incomplete, sourced from reconnaissance aircraft and from the observations of bomber crews who had survived encounters they could not fully explain. He had read about a German aircraft program that had been in development for years, delayed by politics and competing priorities, and the genuine engineering difficulty of putting a jet turbine engine inside an airframe that could withstand combat. He had read about engine failures and takeoff accidents, and Hitler's insistence that the aircraft be used as a bomber rather than as the fighter it was designed to be, an insistence that the Luftwaffe's most capable officers had spent 2 years trying to reverse. He had read all of it, and filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept information that was important, but not yet actionable. It had not felt real. Intelligence reports about revolutionary German aircraft did not feel real in the way that the sky above Regensburg had felt real, or the way that Brest Harbor had felt real on the day they lost 4 men in 11 minutes to flak that came up through the overcast when the forecast had called for clear conditions at altitude. Now, it felt real. He took a last look at the smoke where Morrison had been. Then he turned the Mustang west, toward England, and began to count his remaining aircraft. 6. He had come out with 8. "Form up," he said into the radio. "Tighten it. Watch your fuel. We're going home." The 6 remaining P-51s closed their formation and turned west, and below them, the German landscape slid past indifferently, and Collins flew and did not speak for a very long time, and thought about what he had seen and what it meant and what, if anything, could be done about it. By the time the English Channel appeared at the horizon, He believed he had the beginning of an answer. It was not a comfortable answer. But the work of a fighter pilot in wartime was rarely comfortable, and comfort had never been what he signed his name for. The Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, Swallow, was the first operational jet-powered combat aircraft in history. It carried four 30mm Rheinmetall Borsig Mk108 cannons in its nose, and could reach speeds of approximately 540 miles per hour at altitude, making it roughly 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51D Mustang at comparable heights. Allied pilots who survived early encounters with the aircraft reported that its closing speed made traditional gunnery solutions impossible. By the time a Mustang pilot had acquired a firing solution, the jet had already passed through the engagement and was out of range. The problem had no obvious answer. The men who found one did it the way most military problems are actually solved. Not in the operations rooms of generals, but in the cold and specific thinking of people who had to live with the consequences if they got it wrong. They landed at RAF Leiston at 14 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, coming in low over the Suffolk coast with the autumn light already going amber and the smell of the North Sea in the air. The ground crews met them on the hard stand in the usual way, running to the aircraft as engines cut, pulling chocks, climbing onto the wings to help with harness buckles, and then stopped when they counted the aircraft and got 6 instead of 8. Nobody said anything. The crew chiefs had learned, over months of this, that there was a correct way to receive the news of men who did not come back. And that way was silence and efficiency. Continuing the work, asking no questions until the pilots had climbed down and had something hot in their hands. Collins climbed down from Evangeline and walked across the pierced steel planking of the hard stand without looking at the space where Morrison's aircraft should have been. Sergeant First Class Calvin Pruitt, his crew chief since England, handed him a cup of coffee without being asked and said nothing, and Collins drank it standing up and watched the horizon and thought about the shape of the thing he had seen. The debriefing took place in the operations building 40 minutes after landing. Intelligence Officer Captain Warren Thackeray, a thin man from Connecticut, who wore his uniform as though it had been designed for someone slightly larger, sat at the end of the table with a stenographer beside him and a map of Western Germany pinned to the boards behind him. He had conducted more than 200 such debriefings and had developed a face for them, attentive, neutral, withholding judgment, that Collins had always found either professionally admirable or quietly maddening, depending on the day. Today he found it maddening. "Walk me through the engagement from the moment of first visual," Thackeray said. Collins walked him through it. He was precise with his details, because precision was the only useful thing he could offer, and because Morrison deserved at minimum to be described accurately. He gave compass headings and altitude and the estimated bearing of the attacking aircraft at first observation. He gave the closing speed as best he could estimate it, with the appropriate caveat that his estimate was necessarily rough. He described the sound. He described the shape of the wings. He described the engine pods and the absence of propellers and the absolute speed of the departure after the pass. Thackeray listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he reached into a folder and placed on the table a reconnaissance photograph, slightly blurred, taken from a high-altitude F-5 Lightning over what the annotation identified as Lager Lechfeld Airfield in Bavaria. "Is this consistent with what you saw?" Thackeray asked. Collins looked at the photograph for a long time. The aircraft in it was parked on a concrete apron beside a hangar. Even in the blur of altitude photography, the swept-back wings were distinctive, the twin underwing engine nacelles unmistakable. "Yes," Collins said. "Messerschmitt Me-262, Thackeray said. "We've had reports for some months, a few bomber crews. The Bloody Hundredth had an encounter in August, lost 2 B-17s before they understood what had hit them. We have the aircraft's existence confirmed through ultra intercepts last spring." He paused. We did not know the aircraft had reached operational deployment in numbers sufficient to conduct paired attacks on fighter formations. Well, now you do, said Lieutenant Fox from the far end of the table. His voice was flat in a way that Collins recognized as the specific flatness of a young man who had not yet decided whether to be frightened or furious, and was keeping his options open. The debriefing concluded at 5:30. Collins remained at the table after the others had gone and spread the reconnaissance photographs across it and looked at them with his coffee going cold beside him. Thackeray, gathering his papers, paused at the door. The official guidance from 8th Fighter Command is that P-51 pilots should not attempt to engage Me-262s in pursuit, Thackeray said. The speed differential makes it tactically unsound. I know, Collins said. The guidance suggests breaking off and reporting the contact. I know what the guidance says. Thackeray seemed about to say something further, then apparently decided against it and left. Collins stayed with the photographs until the lamp on the table was the only light in the room. Fox came back at some point, Collins did not hear him come in, and sat down at the opposite end of the table without speaking and looked at the photographs from that distance, too far to see the details clearly, close enough to see the shape of the problem. It's faster than us at altitude, Collins said eventually.
Yes, sir. Faster in a dive. We can't turn inside it because it doesn't need to turn. It makes one pass and accelerates out of our range before we can even acquire a shooting solution. Yes, sir. But it needs a runway, a long, specific, known runway, because its engines need time to reach operating temperature, and its landing speed is high enough that the runway has to be long and smooth. Collins tapped the photograph with one finger. Lechfeld, Neuberg, Brandis. These are the fields we know about. There are others. Ultra will have them, or we can get them from the photo reconnaissance boys. He paused. When it's on the runway, or just off it, with the gear coming up and the throttles not yet at full military power, that's the only time it's our speed. Slower, actually. Fox was quiet for a moment. The 262 pilots know that, Fox said. They'll have their own fighters covering the approaches. They'll try, and we'll have to deal with that as it comes. But the basic tactical fact doesn't change. Collins rolled the photograph up and put it in his pocket, a gesture that Thackeray would have found irregular and that Collins considered entirely necessary. We can't fight this aircraft on its terms. We fight it on the ground's terms. We go to where it has to be slow. He stood up. I'm going to talk to Colonel Grace in the morning. Fox nodded. Then, after a pause that contained a good deal of what neither of them was saying, Morrison was good. He was, Collins said. He'd been playing poker since before some of us could read. He took $42 off me in August, Collins said. I never got the chance to win it back. He turned off the lamp and they walked out into the Suffolk night, which was cold and very dark and smelled of the sea, and above them the stars were clear and numerous in a way that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the simple fact of the Earth turning away from the sun, which it had been doing since long before either of them existed, and would continue to do regardless of what happened over Germany in the days ahead. Collins looked up at the stars for a moment. Then he went inside to write his mission report, and to begin, in the margins of it, the first rough notes of what he intended to propose to Colonel Grace in the morning. The notes were brief. The idea they described was simple. Simple was usually best. Men with complicated plans had a tendency not to come home. The tactic Collins was developing had already been arrived at independently by other pilots in other fighter groups over the autumn of 1944. Major Robin Olds of the 479th Fighter Group, Captain Chuck Yeager of the 357th, and several pilots of the 55th Fighter Group had all reached similar conclusions through similar reasoning, that the only tactically sound method of engaging the Me-262 was to wait near its known operating airfields and attack during takeoff and landing,
when the aircraft's jet engines were either accelerating to operating speed or decelerating from it, and when its airspeed was within the engagement envelope of a P-51. The 8th Air Force formalized this approach, sometimes called airfield hunting or aerodrome patrol, in a directive issued in late 1944. The men who had already been practicing it had arrived there by the most direct possible route: necessity.
Colonel Arthur Grace had been in the Army Air Forces since 1936, which meant he had learned to fly in open cockpit biplanes and had made the transition to monoplanes when most of the men now under his command were still in high school. He had served in the Philippines before the war, had been in England since the spring of 1943, and had the particular quality of stillness that accumulates in men who have sent a great many other men into dangerous situations and have had to live with the outcomes. He was not a cold man. He was a man who had learned that warmth, deployed carelessly, made the losses harder to absorb, and so he rationed it. He received Collins at 0700 in his office, which was a requisitioned farmhouse room that still smelled faintly of the livestock that had occupied the adjoining building until the airfield's construction. A map of Western Germany covered most of one wall. On his desk were 3 ceramic mugs, a stack of operational reports, and a framed photograph of a woman and 2 boys in front of a house in Virginia that Collins had never asked about and Grace had never explained. Collins stood at attention until Grace gestured at the chair across the desk, and then he sat and laid his notes on the table and did not touch them again, because he had decided the night before that he would make this argument from memory or not at all. A man reading from notes looked like a man who did not fully believe what he was saying. He made the argument in 6 minutes. He described the encounter of the previous afternoon with the precision he had already given Thackeray, then moved quickly past the description to the analysis, because Grace had surely already read Thackeray's report, and what he needed from Collins was not the facts, but the interpretation of them. He described the Me-262's performance envelope as best he could reconstruct it from the encounter, and from the intelligence documents he had reviewed the previous evening. He described its dependencies: the long concrete runway, the slow engine spool-up time, the elevated landing speed that required the pilot's full attention during the approach. He described what those dependencies meant for a flight of P-51s operating at low altitude in the vicinity of a known jet airfield at dawn. Grace listened without expression. When Collins finished, Grace was quiet for long enough that Collins began to count the seconds. He reached 11 before Grace spoke. 8th Fighter Command's current guidance is to avoid engagement, Grace said. 8th Fighter Command's current guidance was written by men who haven't seen the aircraft in the air, Collins said. He caught himself, added, "Sir?" Grace looked at him steadily. That's an ungenerous characterization of staff officers who are working from the same intelligence we all have. Yes, sir, it is. Another pause. The tactic you're describing puts your flight at low altitude over a defended German airfield, Grace said. The flak concentrations at Luftwaffe jet bases have been significantly reinforced. We know this from reconnaissance and from signals intelligence. They understand exactly what their vulnerability window is, and they have responded accordingly. I know, sir. You'll be in the engagement envelope of light and medium flak from the moment you cross the airfield boundary. I know that too. And you still want to do this? Collins thought about Morrison, which he had been trying not to do since the previous afternoon, because the time for thinking about Morrison was not now, and would not be for a long time yet. He thought about it for 3 seconds anyway, then put it away. I want to do this because the alternative is that we continue to lose men and aircraft to an enemy that we currently have no answer for, Collins said. The Me-262 is in production. The Luftwaffe is expanding its jet units. Every week that passes without an effective counter-tactic is a week in which the balance of the air war shifts in a direction we cannot afford. He paused. Morrison was the best wingman I've had in 3 years of this.
The man who killed him was flying an aircraft we currently have no tactical doctrine for engaging. That seems to me like a problem that requires a solution, sir, not a guidance memorandum telling us to break off contact. Grace looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the map. Lechfeld, he said. It's the most active of the confirmed jet bases. Ultra traffic suggests the third Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 7 has been operating from there since September. Photo reconnaissance from last week shows between 14 and 18 Me-262s on the hard stands. What do you need? 4 aircraft, my most experienced pilots. Pre-dawn departure to arrive over the target at first usable light, when the jet pilots will be beginning their morning operations. Low-level approach to avoid early radar detection. Communication silence from the initial point to the target. Grace nodded slowly, still looking at the map. I'll want a full plan on paper before I approve the mission. Routes, altitudes, contingencies, fuel calculations, abort criteria. I'll have it to you by 1600 today, sir. And Collins. Grace finally looked away from the map and directly at him. I'm approving this because the tactical argument is sound, not because of what happened to Morrison. Those are 2 separate things, and I want them kept separate. Understood, sir. Morrison was a good officer. He deserves to be remembered as a good officer, not as a reason for a mission that gets 4 more men killed. Yes, sir. Collins picked up his notes from the table, still unread, just as he had intended, and stood and came to attention and turned for the door. One more thing, Grace said. Collins stopped. The guidance from 8th Fighter Command is, as I said, to avoid engagement. I am approving a mission that constitutes a deliberate engagement under a different tactical framework. I want the plan written carefully enough that the distinction is clear to anyone who reads it. Grace's voice was even and unhurried. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You're telling me to write it so that it describes airfield interdiction rather than fighter interception, sir. I'm telling you to write it accurately, Grace said, which is the same thing. Collins almost smiled. Yes, sir. He spent the rest of the morning at the operations table with Fox and with the 2 other pilots he had already chosen. Lieutenant Samuel Park, 28, from Seattle, 61 missions, a man who flew with an economy of motion that was almost mechanical in its consistency, and Lieutenant Henry Prudhomme, 25, from New Orleans, 44 missions, the best marksman in the squadron by a margin that the gunnery scores made embarrassing for everyone else. He spread the reconnaissance photographs and the ultra-derived airfield charts across the table, and they worked through the plan in the methodical, unhurried way of men who understood that the quality of preparation had a direct relationship to the probability of coming home. They flew the route on paper 3 times before Collins was satisfied with it. They identified the flak positions marked on the most recent reconnaissance imagery and planned the ingress line to minimize exposure time. They agreed on the abort criteria: engine trouble, weather below minimums, enemy fighter presence in numbers exceeding what 4 P-51s could manage while also conducting the primary mission. And they wrote them down explicitly, because experienced pilots did not always make clear-headed decisions in the moment, and it was better to have the criteria established in advance. By 1530, Collins had the plan written. By 1600, he had delivered it to Grace's adjutant. By 1800, Grace had approved it, with 2 minor amendments to the abort criteria that Collins read, considered, and found reasonable. They would go the following morning. Collins ate in the mess that evening without appetite, drank 1 cup of coffee, and went to bed at 2100. He lay in the dark for a while and listened to the Suffolk wind moving around the edges of the Nissen hut, and thought about geometry and speed and the specific angle of approach that would give him the best deflection shot on an aircraft climbing out of a German airfield at dawn. When he finally slept, he slept without dreaming, which was the gift that exhaustion sometimes gave. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had established dedicated flak defenses around its principal Me-262 bases, concentrating light 20mm and heavy 88mm guns in overlapping fields of fire along the most likely approach corridors. The German jet pilots themselves were well aware of their vulnerability during takeoff and landing phases, and requested fighter escort during these periods, a request that was granted inconsistently, owing to the declining strength of conventional Luftwaffe fighter forces.
The window of vulnerability that Allied pilots sought to exploit was real, and the Germans knew it was real, which meant that attacking a jet airfield in 1944 was a matter of accepting significant risk in exchange for the possibility of an engagement that could otherwise not be forced on favorable terms. They took off from Leiston at 0542 on the 8th of October 1944, in darkness that was just beginning to separate itself from true night, the eastern horizon holding the first gray suggestion of dawn, not yet color, not yet warmth, only the faint diminishing of absolute black into something slightly less absolute. Collins led the flight off the runway in pairs, gear coming up cleanly, the 4 Merlin engines settling into the rhythmic hammer of cruise power as they turned southeast and descended to low altitude over the North Sea. 800 feet above the water, then 500. The lower they flew, the less radar coverage they presented, and radar coverage was the difference between arriving at Lechfeld with surprise intact and arriving to find every flak battery on the field already tracking them. Fox flew on Collins's right wing, 30 feet of separation and slightly stepped down, close enough that Collins could see the luminescent dial of Fox's altimeter when the younger man's cockpit caught the growing light. Park and Prudhomme flew behind them in the same formation, a finger 4 that the Luftwaffe had invented in the Spanish Civil War and the Americans had spent the early months of 1942 painfully relearning after the losses that came from flying the old, tight, parade ground formations that looked impressive at air shows and got men killed in combat. Collins had forbidden radio communication from the moment of wheels up, except in the event of a declared emergency. The 4 aircraft flew in silence, broken only by engine noise, and each man was alone with whatever he had brought into the cockpit that morning. Collins had brought a photograph. He had taken it out of his breast pocket during the engine run-up and looked at it for a moment in the red glow of the cockpit instruments. A woman and 2 children on the porch of a white frame house in Columbus, Ohio, squinting into summer sun, the woman shading her eyes with one hand, and then returned it to his pocket and turned his attention to the business of the mission. He did not take it out again. They crossed the Dutch coast at low level, threading between the known flak positions along the Frisian Islands, and then they were over occupied territory, and the sky around them was the gray of very early morning, and below them the Dutch farmland was flat and geometric, and crossed with canals that caught what little light there was and held it in long silver lines. Collins watched the compass and the clock and the landmarks he had memorized from the planning maps. The Rhine, the junction of the Rhine and the Main, the first low hills of Bavaria beginning to lift the horizon. He had flown this route in his head a dozen times the previous evening, and he flew it now with the confidence of a man following a path he knows well, which is a different thing from confidence in the outcome. They crossed into Bavaria at 0721. Collins nudged the flight lower, 300 feet now, the Mustang skimming the autumn fields close enough that the prop wash flattened the long grass in their wake. The cold air at this altitude was dense, and the Merlins were pulling hard, and everything about the aircraft felt immediate and physical in a way that high-altitude flight did not. The ground close enough to remind you at every second what stopping suddenly would mean. At 0734, Collins saw Lechfeld. The airfield was laid out in the flat valley of the Lech River south of Augsburg, a long concrete runway oriented northeast-southwest, with dispersal areas and hardstands along the northern edge, and a cluster of hangars and operations buildings at the southern end. In the early morning light, it was clearly visible from 3 miles out. And what was also clearly visible, to Collins's particular attention, was the movement on the runway. A single aircraft, accelerating through its takeoff roll, still on the ground,
engines producing the high, thin wail that he recognized from the previous day's encounter, with the quality of recognition you only get from surviving an experience. He checked his watch. 07:35. The jet pilots flew early, before the Allied fighter sweeps reached their operating areas. He had planned for this. He had planned for exactly this. He waggled his wings twice, the signal they had agreed on, no radio, and pushed the throttle forward to military power and pulled the nose up fractionally to set the intercept angle. Not toward where the ME-262 was, toward where it would be in 4 seconds. The geometry was the whole answer. The geometry was everything. The ME-262 lifted off the runway, and the gear began to retract, and the engines, still accelerating toward their operating speed, were producing less than their full rated thrust. The aircraft was climbing at a shallow angle, heavy with fuel. The pilot's attention divided between the instruments and the horizon ahead. And it was at this precise moment, gear transitioning, engines spooling, airspeed building but not yet built, that the 4 P-51s came out of the low ground to the north, and the pilot of the German jet saw them and understood, in whatever fraction of a second understanding takes, that he had no good options. He tried to accelerate. The Jumo 044 turbojets needed time that he did not have. He tried to turn.
At the speed he was carrying, a hard turn bled energy he could not afford to lose. He was, for the first and perhaps only time in the operational life of his extraordinary aircraft, slow enough to be caught. Collins took the shot from 300 yards, a deflection angle that required him to lead the target by what felt like an impossible margin, and was in fact the mathematically correct margin, the product of hours of training and thousands of rounds expended at aerial gunnery sleeves over the Gulf of Mexico in what felt like another lifetime. The 4 50 caliber machine guns in each wing fired together, and the tracer rounds arced across the morning sky in a line that began behind the ME-262 and walked forward into the left engine nacelle. The engine exploded. Not dramatically, not the way fuel tanks exploded with a great orange fireball, but with the specific violence of a turbine coming apart at operating speed, which produced a dense black cloud of burning metal and oil and a shock that rocked the jet's left wing down hard. The aircraft yawed violently left. The pilot made one more control input, a last attempt to recover, and then the cockpit canopy flew off and the ejection seat fired and a figure separated from the aircraft and a parachute deployed almost immediately, which meant the German pilot was alive, which Collins noted with a feeling he could not have described precisely and did not try to. The ME-262 rolled inverted and went straight in. The impact was a column of black smoke rising into the morning sky at the edge of the airfield. And then the flak started. The German gunners had not been idle. They had tracked the incoming flight from the moment it emerged from the low ground, and they had held their fire because the ME-262 was in the engagement area and they could not shoot without risk of hitting their own aircraft. But now the jet was down, and there was nothing between the guns and the 4 Mustangs, and the sky around Collins's flight turned immediately and thoroughly hostile. Black bursts of 88mm shells filled the air at altitude above them, the heavy guns shooting on predicted courses, not yet fully tracking. And the lighter 20mm tracers came up in streams from the dispersal area to the north, fast and flat and closer than comfortable. Collins broke the flight hard right and descended further, trading altitude for speed and for the geometric problem he presented to the tracking radar, which functioned less efficiently against targets that were changing altitude and heading simultaneously. He heard the sharp crack of a nearby burst and felt the Mustang shudder once. Not a hit, the pressure wave of a close detonation. And then they were past the northern boundary of the airfield, and the ground was rising gently toward the first foothills to the east, and the flak was dropping behind. He rolled wings level and climbed back to 500 feet and did his check. 3 aircraft with him. Then he heard Prudhomme's voice on the radio, clipped and precise,
the first words spoken since Leiston. "Hydraulics. I've lost hydraulic pressure. Left system." Collins looked right and found Prudhomme's aircraft. No visible smoke, no fire, but a dark stain along the left side of the fuselage that meant hydraulic fluid, which meant landing gear and possibly left brakes. "Can you fly it?" Collins said. "Flying it now, sir. Left aileron's heavy but responsive. Gear's the problem. I may not get the left main to extend." "Understood. Stay with us." He had known, planning this mission, that flak was the price of the tactic. He had written it into the plan explicitly, under the heading of anticipated risks. He had written it, and accepted it, and he accepted it again now, looking at Prudhomme's aircraft with its hydraulic stain and its pilot's calm voice on the radio. And he set a course northwest toward the Rhine, and began to think about what a landing on one main gear looked like, and what the approach speed should be, and which airfield along the return route had the longest runway and the best crash equipment. They had been over Lechfeld for less than 90 seconds. The Junkers UMO 213 and UMO 044 turbojets that powered the ME 262 required between 30 seconds and 1 minute to accelerate from idle to full military thrust, a significant delay compared to piston engines, which could respond to throttle inputs almost instantaneously. This spool-up lag was the aircraft's principal tactical vulnerability on takeoff. During this window, a ME 262 that had just left the runway was flying at speeds of between 180 and 220 miles per hour indicated, within the engagement envelope of Allied piston fighters. The window lasted approximately 30 seconds from liftoff to the point at which the jet's superior speed placed it beyond practical pursuit. They crossed back into Allied-controlled territory at 0917, coming over the front lines near Eindhoven at low altitude in the thin October morning, with the sun now fully up and the sky around them empty and honest in the way that Collins had noted at the start of the previous day, though it felt like considerably longer ago than that. Prudhomme's aircraft was still flying. It was flying with the left aileron slightly sluggish and the hydraulic system for the left landing gear producing no pressure readings on the cockpit gauge, which meant that when they landed, there was a meaningful probability that the left main gear would not extend fully and lock, and a meaningful probability after that of what the manuals described as a gear collapse on rollout, and what the men who had seen one described in less technical terms. Collins had called ahead on the VHF. Manston, on the Kent coast, had the longest available runway on their return route, nearly 10,000 feet of concrete, built out over the chalk cliffs for exactly this category of situation. A field that had received more damaged aircraft over the course of the war than any other airfield in England, and had the crash equipment and the medical facilities and the long institutional experience with bad landings that the situation required. They were directed there without discussion. The controller at Manston had heard the hydraulics problem and had heard Collins's voice, and had not asked unnecessary questions, which Collins appreciated. The channel crossing took 23 minutes. Collins flew the whole of it on Prudhomme's left wing, close enough to watch the aircraft and the pilot simultaneously. Close enough to see when Prudhomme worked the emergency gear extension handle, a mechanical backup system that used nitrogen pressure rather than hydraulic fluid to force the gear down, and to see the result, which was that the right main gear extended and locked, and the nose gear extended and locked, and the left main gear extended to approximately 3/4 of its travel and stopped there. The indicator light on Prudhomme's panel showing neither fully up nor fully down, which was the worst of the available readings because it meant the gear was in an intermediate position that could collapse either way on contact with the runway. "Talk me through what you have," Collins said. "Right main locked," Prudhomme said. "Nose gear locked. Left main is at approximately 70% extension, no lock indication." A pause. "I can feel it in the airframe. It's not solid." "Understood. Manston has the equipment. You'll make a normal approach at normal speed and touch down on the right main first. Hold the left wing up as long as you can with aileron and let it settle. When it settles, you get on the right brake only. Do not touch the left. I know the procedure, sir. I know you know it. I'm saying it out loud because saying it out loud is what you do. A brief silence, then, yes, sir. They reached Manston at 09:47. The field was already prepared. Collins could see the crash trucks positioned along the left side of the runway, the ambulance at the far end, the long red fire vehicle with its crew in silver suits standing beside it. The runway itself was foamed along the left half of the first 3,000 feet, which meant that if the left gear collapsed and Prudhomme went off the center line to the left, the foam would reduce the friction and with it the probability of fire. It was the correct preparation. Someone at Manston had seen this before and had done the thinking. Fox and Park peeled off and entered the holding pattern. Collins stayed with Prudhomme through the initial approach, talking him through nothing in particular. Airspeed, configuration, the weather which was clear and the wind which was nearly calm. The practical conditions being as favorable as they were ever going to be, until the final turn, when he pulled up and away because there was nothing more he could do, and being in the way would only make it worse. Prudhomme flew the approach with the steadiness that 44 combat missions had given him. He crossed the runway threshold at 110 miles per hour indicated, which was exactly correct, and he touched the right main gear to the concrete with a precision that Collins, watching from 1,000 feet above in a wide left orbit, found almost painful in its care. The aircraft settled onto the right main and the nose gear and ran straight for perhaps 400 feet, Prudhomme holding the left wing up with full right aileron. The Mustang tilted at an angle that looked wrong and was wrong, but was the correct wrong for the circumstance. Then the left wing came down. The left gear touched and held for 1 second, and then folded inward, and the left wing scraped the concrete, and the aircraft yawed hard left and departed the center line into the foamed section of the runway, shedding pieces of the left wingtip as it went, the propeller striking the concrete and disintegrating in a spray of aluminum, the aircraft slowing rapidly through a combination of friction and the drag of the collapsed gear, rotating slowly left as it decelerated, and coming to rest, facing almost directly back the way it had come, at a point approximately 2,100 feet from the threshold, in the middle of the foam, right way up, not on fire. Collins let out a breath. The crash trucks were moving before the aircraft had fully stopped. Collins watched from above as the figures in silver suits ran to the cockpit and the canopy came back and Prudhomme climbed out under his own power and stepped down onto the wing root and bent onto the concrete and stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, looking at what was left of his aircraft. Collins entered the landing pattern. He touched down and cleared the runway and taxied to the dispersal area where Prudhomme was now sitting on the step of an ambulance with a blanket around his shoulders and a cup of something hot in his hands, talking to a medical officer with the particular air of a man who is answering questions he considers unnecessary. Collins shut the engine down and climbed out and walked across. "Left gear," Prudhomme said before Collins could speak. "I thought it might hold." "It almost did," Collins said. 2,000 feet. "Yes, sir." Collins looked at the wrecked Mustang on the runway, which was being approached cautiously by a recovery crew with a tug and a dolly. The aircraft had been with the 364th since the previous spring. He did not know if it could be repaired. He suspected not. He thought about what it had cost to build it and ship it across the Atlantic and maintain it, and what it had accomplished in the months of its operational life. And then he stopped thinking about it, because that kind of accounting led in directions that were not useful. "You did it right," Collins said. "The approach was exactly right." "The gear failed," Prudhomme said. "The gear failed. That's different from you failing. The gear failed and you put it down straight and nobody burned." Collins looked at him steadily. "That's what a good pilot does. He controls what he can control." Prudhomme was quiet for a moment. The medical officer made a note on his clipboard and moved away with the tact of a man who recognized a conversation he should not be part of. "We got one," Prudhomme said. "We got one," Collins agreed. Fox and Park had landed behind them and were walking across the dispersal area. Fox's face carried the expression of a man who had watched Prudhomme's landing from the holding pattern and was still metabolizing it. Park, characteristically, showed nothing. The four of them stood together for a moment in the October morning at the edge of a Kent airfield, with the chalk smell of the coast on the wind and the sound of the channel somewhere below the cliffs. Collins looked east, toward the continent, which was invisible from here but present in the way that large and unresolved things are always present. "They'll have another one in the air tomorrow," Fox said. He was not asking a question. "Yes," Collins said. "And the day after." "Yes." Fox looked at him. "Then we go back." "Every morning until it's finished," Collins said. "That's the work." He reached into his breast pocket and took out the photograph and looked at it for a moment in the pale English sunlight. The woman, the two children, the White House in Columbus, and then he put it away again. Park had already found a ride to the operations building to begin the paperwork. Prudhomme was arguing gently with the medical officer about whether he needed to be examined. Fox was looking east with the expression of a young man in the process of becoming something harder and more durable than he had been when the morning started, which was not a bad thing to become under the circumstances. Collins walked toward the operations building. There was a mission report to write, and a debrief to give, and a telephone call to make to Leaston, explaining the status of 1 aircraft and 4 pilots. And after that, there would be the planning for the following morning, and after that, sleep. And after that, the work would begin again. He had said what he meant, every morning until it finished. He did not know when that would be. Nobody did. But the jet airfields were known, and the vulnerability window was real, and the tactic was sound. And sound tactics applied consistently by competent men had a way of accumulating into outcomes, which was perhaps the most that could ever be said about any of this. The door of the operations building closed behind him. Outside, the Kent sky was clear and wide and honest, and somewhere over the horizon, Germany was continuing its war. And somewhere, on a Bavarian airfield, a ground crew was looking at a column of smoke at the edge of the runway, and beginning to understand that the morning had not gone the way the morning was supposed to go, and the pilots who would fly the following day were being briefed, and the guns were being reloaded, and the fuel trucks were moving, and all of it would still be there at dawn. Fox stood alone on the hardstand for a moment longer. Then he reached into his jacket and found the letter he had started 3 days ago, the one addressed to his mother in Dayton that he had not yet finished. He looked at it. He put it back. He would finish it tonight, in the specific and ordinary way that men who survive remarkable days finish the ordinary things they have been putting off. He would describe none of what had happened. She did not need to know. What she needed was to know he was well, and he was well, and he would tell her that, and that would be enough. And in the morning, he would get back in the airplane. He turned and followed Collins inside. Between the autumn of 1944 and the end of the war in Europe in May of 1945, Allied fighter pilots destroyed or damaged approximately 150 Me-262 aircraft, the majority of them near their operating airfields during takeoff and landing operations. The tactic was never officially named and was arrived at independently by multiple pilots across several fighter groups. Among them, Captain Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group, Major Robin Olds of the 479th, and Captain Clayton Kelly Spar of the 55th, who was himself shot down and captured while conducting an airfield attack in March of 1945. The Me-262 never achieved the operational impact that its performance specifications suggested it should have. Production difficulties, fuel shortages, pilot training limitations, and, critically, the vulnerability of its operating bases to the very tactic described in these pages combined to limit its effectiveness. It remained, however, the most advanced combat aircraft of the Second World War, and the lessons derived from its design and operation formed the foundation of jet aviation doctrine for the decade that followed. The men who found a way to fight it did so with the tools they had and the time they had, for the reasons that men in that position always have. Because the alternative was unacceptable, and because they were there, and because the work was theirs to do. Some of them came home, some did not. The ones who came home mostly did not talk about it much. That too is a kind of answer.